Hi, friends. This is Mrs. Condit with your screencast on the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877. So, our plan here today is to talk about sort of how it is that Reconstruction ends. And the way that we're going to tackle that is through this essential question. And your essential question is posted at the top of the screen. How did Reconstruction come to an end? In order to talk about this, how did Reconstruction come to an end, I thought that we would break this section of the lecture up into some headings. And I want to address a few of these along the way. And some of this is going to be a bit of a review, which is, I think, important when we talk about how a time period in history ends. So let's talk a little bit about some of the conditions prior to 1876. So this is sort of your review portion. One of the things that you learned about earlier on when you were looking at the three Reconstruction plans is that when the Civil War ended, Congress felt it was really important to create what were called military districts. And I have this map here identifying the military districts. You can see that there were 5 of them. And in each military district, Northern troops remained in the South. Think of them as like military bases today. It's really no different. And the purpose of those military bases today, just like, at this time during Reconstruction, is to ensure that there is stability in the region. In the era of Reconstruction, the intent was to keep Northern soldiers, or what were Union soldiers, into the South to make sure that formerly enslaved people are being given access to things, also to ensure economic stability, to make sure that there's not like any hot spots of violence, etc. But by 1876, these military districts start collapsing, and one of the ways they collapse is because if a state, say in my case here, Texas and Louisiana, which are in District 5, if both of those states had reconstructed their governments, which is my second bullet point, meaning they had accepted the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Acts, if they had done all of these things, then the military could be removed from that state, because the federal government's intent meant that, well, if you're accepting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, well, then you must be on board with ensuring that there is equality for formerly enslaved people. So as these Southern governments start reconstructing, the military districts collapse. But moving on to my third bullet point, we know that Southern states, as soon as those military districts left, those Southern states started enacting Black codes and Jim Crow laws. So those things are in place. And Ms. Kiefer identified that in a essential question in this unit. So please refer back to that if you need some help in that area. We've also been talking about the rise of Klan violence. So we know that the KKK developed during this time period, that the Klan intended on creating fear in the community where formerly enslaved people lived, as well as, of course, they targeted carpetbaggers and scalawags. So there is this Klan violence that's emerging, and we see this increase in the number of lynchings in the South during this time period. So keep in mind all of these things. I think in order to talk about how Reconstruction comes to an end, we also need to talk briefly about what voting looks like in the time period, because it's going to be tied to this issue of an election, as you'll see here in a moment. So I think voting in many ways has changed. We're in election season, and people are talking a lot about voting, but I think we need to kind of put it back in the framework of what did voting look like in 1876. Well, first of all, citizens could vote for local elections. They could vote for the mayoral race, their city council, sheriff, etc. And then they could vote for the House of Representatives. So just as we living here in Southwest Washington have a race for the 3rd congressional seat between Jamie Herrera Butler and Carolyn Long, people back in 1876 were able to vote for that seat as well. So they would be able to vote for whoever they were going to send to the House of Representatives in Congress. Now, people could also do what's called the popular vote, and that's when you can vote for the president. But I do want to remind you that the people's vote for the president is not the vote that gets the president elected. The Constitution is very clear on this. In fact, many American citizens did not even vote for president prior to the 1820s. Like, it wasn't an option on the table. The Electoral College is the one, according to the U.S. Constitution, that officially selects the president. And that, of course, is still the case today. You and I expect to hear on the night of November 3rd, maybe the morning of November 4th, who the new president is going to be for this term, or whether President Trump will win a second term. But in this case, that wasn't the case in 1876. The people voted, but they really didn't have large influence over their elections. So the Electoral College still really did elect the president, and people waited to see what the Electoral College had to say when it came to that vote. If you have questions about how the Electoral College operates and you want to know more about them, please don't hesitate to ask. We're happy to make sure that you have a better understanding of that, because it is important to understand in terms of elections. I think it's also important to identify who can vote. It is men ages 21 and older. Women were not permitted in 1876. In nearly every state to vote. Now, there are a couple exceptions. There's one big glaring exception, and that is the state of Wyoming allowed women to vote who were 21 and older. Wyoming allowed women the right to vote at 1869. But at that point in time, really, they're the only state. Now, women in some communities had the right to vote, like they could vote for mayoral race or a school board if they had one. That'd be pretty rare at this time. But essentially, it's men ages 21 and older. I wanted to identify who is voting. It's white men ages 21 and older in Southern communities. People of color would have been able to vote in the North, particularly men of color would have been able to vote in Northern communities. But by and large, in Southern communities, it is white men. And that is because of those Jim Crow laws, again, referencing the previous screencast. That's not to say that men of color or formerly enslaved people couldn't vote. Like, they could actually legally vote. They just weren't able to because of Jim Crow laws. So how does Reconstruction come to an end? I want to talk with you a little bit about the election of 1876. So in order to talk about how Reconstruction comes to an end, we need to talk about this election. And in 1876, we have two candidates. We have candidate Sam Tilden, who is a Democrat from the state of New York, and we have candidate Rutherford B. Hayes, who is a Republican from the state of Ohio. Both popular within their parties. So what are the results? What's interesting about this election is this is one of the elections in U.S. history where the person who wins the most votes, popular votes, does not win the electoral votes, right? We've seen some examples of that in U.S. history. So this is the case. Sam Tilden actually wins the popular vote, but as we talked about, the popular vote in this case does not matter. It is the electoral vote that elects the president. So as the Electoral College is trying to work through their voting system, and the Electoral College votes after the American people do, there were 3 states' Electoral College votes that were in dispute: Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Each party, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, said that their votes were being given to like their candidate, meaning like the Democrats said, oh, Sam Tilden won the vote in my state, therefore let's give him the 8 votes towards his Electoral College count. Meanwhile, Rutherford B. Hayes and the Republican Party in Louisiana said, no, clearly Rutherford Hayes has won our state, and therefore these 8 votes from Louisiana should go to him. So there's this contesting that occurs, and it happens in 3 states, which is basically like 20 electoral votes. And those 20 electoral votes was going to be the decision maker. So what happens? Well, in the case where it's really unclear who the president is going to be because there's a dispute in the election ends up in the House of Representatives. And this has happened again in a few times in U.S. history. This happened in the 1800 election. This happened in 1824. And yet again, this happened now in 1876. So the election goes to the House. And the rules are set by the House of Representatives as to how they want to determine who the winner is going to be of the election. In this case, the House decides to put it to a small committee, and the small committee is going to be responsible for figuring this mess out. What do you do when you have disputed votes and ballots? So here is what the committee decides, and this is known as the Compromise of 1877, which is one of your terms. So the House Republicans and the House Democrats decide to strike a deal. They decide to give the election to Hayes if Hayes can agree upon a few things. One, he has to be willing to remove the remaining military from the South. So all military troops have to be removed. And again, I'll remind you that the military is there to protect formerly enslaved people and to ensure stability in the region. So I think it's important to recognize that the removal of the military, we know, effectively ends any federal protection for formerly enslaved people. So at this point in time, the U.S. government is deciding, if they want to give this election to Hayes, that they're going to wash their hands of the South and let the South be. And Hayes has to agree to push forward legislation and to sign a bill that will connect the railroads in the North to the South. The North had, by this time, basically fully industrialized, which is something we're going to talk about in the next unit. They had a thorough, effective transportation network that simply the South just did not have. The South was relying on waterways for transportation and not necessarily railroads. And so the deal is that if Hayes can become president, then he's going to connect and create some Southern railroads, which is going to create a bigger transportation network to get crops out of the South. The Republican Party agrees, and Hayes becomes the new U.S. president. And in essence, Reconstruction comes to an end. And no longer do we see in this era any federal protection for formerly enslaved people. So all the work that Congress had attempted to do after the Civil War is done. And it's over, and it's sort of a washing of the hands of the South. And I think that there's a lot of what ifs here as we end this unit in Reconstruction. And that is, what if Tilden had won? What if Hayes had won under different conditions? What if he hadn't agreed to remove the military? We do know this. Hayes wrote in his diary, people were big diary writers back in the 1800s, and Hayes wrote in his diary that he felt flawed by accepting this compromise. He knew what the result was, and he had to live with it. And later in life, recognized that this decision certainly cost many lives in the Deep South. And so it's something just to sit on and to recognize that Reconstruction comes to an end in a really unsatisfying way. The work abruptly halts. And I think if we reflect back today, I think that there's some big questions about the next 120 years, 130, 40 years that emerge after this Compromise of 1877, and what history would have looked like had Reconstruction been continued and military protection continued in the South. So we'll stop on that note. Please let us know if you have any questions.